Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 43, The Road to Verdun. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Charles and Louis made an alliance against Lothar, but appeared unable to link up, until Louis lured Lothar's main supporter in the east into a trap and killed him. Moving quickly, Louis and his army joined up with Charles several weeks later. Still, Lothar was supported by his nephew Pippin, so the two sides appeared evenly matched when they faced each other at Fontenoy. The battle was a bloodbath, and Lothar was forced to flee. None of the key leaders had died, so it seemed that the struggle would continue. Actually, it wouldn't. Fontenoy had been the first large-scale battle between Franks in a century, and none of the nobles in the empire had any desire to repeat the experience. Most important, Charles and Louis remained united, so Lothar accepted that he would have to negotiate with his brothers. However, detailed negotiations would have to wait until the brothers had dealt with the internal issues in their respective territories. Meanwhile, the Vikings continued to raid Frankia. Initially, small parties had attacked isolated areas like monasteries. These raids were usually carried out by roughly 100 men in several ships, relying on speed to avoid revenge from the Empire soldiers. Since they only wanted plunder, not territory, they were difficult to trap or even find. I need to be clear, these raids initially only bothered the local residents, but the raids grew in size until the Danes launched several major raids, sacking Rouen in 841 and Kennewick in 842. Officially, he denied any responsibility, which was probably true. Horik was old by then and likely had little interest in provoking a powerful neighbor. Anyway, Horik was based in the southern region close to the Frankish Empire, and it is unlikely that he controlled all of Denmark. The raiders were probably independent operators and may have been based in the north. Honestly, little is known of the situation within Denmark at the time. These coastal areas were disputed between Charles and Lothar, so they were unable to cooperate to organize better defenses. Even so, Charles did not make much effort to deal with the raids. Even though Kennewick had been hit hard in June 842, he decided that his nephew Pippin was the greater threat, so Charles spent the summer hunting Pippin. Although he failed to capture his rival, Charles clearly felt that Aquitaine was stable, so he left Duke Warren in charge of the region and traveled to Metz to meet with his brothers. At the same time, Louis had been dealing with a peasant revolt. Actually, peasant revolts were rare because peasants were well aware that hungry men with pitchforks would be slaughtered by armored soldiers on horseback. However, warfare is destructive, and people had become so tired of burned-out farms that a large number of peasants rose up in Saxony calling themselves the Stalinga, comrades in arms in Old Saxon. It should not be a surprise that the Stalinga revolt occurred in Saxony, which had been brutally subjugated by Louis's grandfather Charles the Great more than a generation earlier. Even so, people remembered a period when free and semi-free members of society had had more rights. They resented the forced conversion to Christianity and domination by the nobles. The lengthy civil war between the brothers gave the rebels an opportunity because Louis had marched with his nobles and their followers to support his ally Charles against Lothar. The Stalinga likely hoped that Louis's army would be defeated on some far-off battlefield, but honestly, their future was grim, regardless of which brother won. No noble likes uppity peasants. Anyway, Louis's army survived the battle. Well, most of the army survived. Once the civil war had ended, Louis returned home and crushed the revolt. Over 100 leaders were executed and hundreds more lost limbs. The brutal measures worked, and Saxony remained peaceful, well, stable. Having settled their own domestic issues, the brothers agreed to meet in early October at Metz, chosen because it was the burial site of their father. Each brother delegated 40 commissioners to prepare the actual division of the lands, but apparently tensions were still high, so the commissioners would sleep on opposite sides of the river to avoid any fights during the night, presumably when they had adjourned for a drink or two after a hard day of negotiating. However, a new problem appeared. The representatives soon discovered that they did not know the actual composition of the empire. Wait, that makes no sense. How could they possibly not know the wealth of their own lands? Well, unlike the Roman Empire, which had funded itself through taxation, the Frankish kings and emperors funded their small bureaucracies through limited taxation and loot from campaigns. Since the kings and emperors could not afford a proper bureaucracy, they had no clear idea of how much wealth was in the empire. Remember, the empire stretched across most of Western Europe, from Barcelona on the southern side of the Pyrenees to Denmark in the north, excluding Brittany, and from northern Italy into the Balkans. It was a big empire. The development of an actual empire over a large geographical area would have required the development of a proper bureaucracy, along with a real taxation system. To be fair, a rough administration had emerged near the end of the reign of Charles the Great, but this basic administration had probably faded due to the instability caused by the repeated revolts by Louis's sons. Obviously, some counts and abbots and bishops kept good records, or employed clerks who kept good records, but there was no central record of tax returns and assessments of the value of properties. Realizing that they could not divide an empire if they did not know the actual value of the various regions, the brothers agreed that a delay was preferable to another war caused by an unintentionally unfair division, so they agreed to send officials to map out the empire. Their representatives were permitted to travel throughout the empire to prepare a giant list of all of the bishoprics, monasteries, royal palaces, manors, estates, and markets. Since the empire was a big place, the officials were given until July the following year to gather the information. So, what would the brothers do while they waited for the officials to finish their work? Well, Charles got married. He was 19 years old. The wedding took place in December 842, and the bride was Ermentrude, daughter of the deceased Count Odo of Orleans, currently in the care of the Count's brother-in-law, Adelar, who had been a senior official under Emperor Louis. A cousin of Bernard of Septimania, Odo had remained loyal to Emperor Louis when Matfred of Orleans and Hugh of Tours had led a revolt in 830. Odo had been given Matfred's lands and had then been killed by Matfred in 834. More recently, Adelard had commanded a wing of the combined army at Fontenoy. In fact, it is worth asking if the marriage alliance was the price of Adelard's support at Fontenoy. More important, the marriage highlights the difference between Charles and his older brothers. Lothar and Louis were experienced rulers who already had networks of supporters in their respective core territories. Moreover, Adalbert, Louis's main rival in the east, was dead. However, Charles had very little experience ruling. Obviously, he had supporters, but that network of supporters had been built by his mother Judith, who was ill and would die soon. While the exact boundaries of his new kingdom would not be known until after the survey was complete, Charles likely expected to receive Neustria and keep Aquitaine. So he built a network of supporters in those regions. Unsurprisingly, Adelard became the senior noble in Charles's court, Count Warin was made Duke of Aquitaine, and a powerful noble named Vivian became his chamberlain. After months of hard work, the survey of everything of value in the empire was finally completed. Sadly, no one thought to keep a copy of the list, but it served as the basis of the division. In early summer, word reached the brothers that their commissioners had completed their surveys, so they all made their way to Verdun, which had been chosen for the final treaty negotiations because it was a central location. While the brothers negotiated, the borders were weakly defended and Scandinavian raiders took advantage, sacking Nantes in June. Count Renaud died in the fighting, although he might have been killed by a rival, Count Lambert, and the Vikings had simply taken advantage of the feud between rival nobles to loot a port. Why would Lambert have wanted to kill Renaud? Well, Lambert had roots in the region and had fought for Charles at Fontenoy. Instead, Renaud had been appointed Count of Nantes. Unlike Lambert, Renaud was not from Western Neustria, but was related to Vivian, the new chamberlain, so Renaud could squeeze Lambert out of royal patronage. So Lambert had resorted to drastic measures. Anyway, the brothers were focused on their negotiations. The key issue was Central Frankia. There was no debate that Louis would keep Bavaria, Lothar would keep Italy, and Charles would keep Aquitaine. The question was, how would the rest of the empire be divided? Clearly, the Frankish heartland was the main source of wealth since each brother wanted part of it. The Treaty of Verdun was signed in August. Louis kept Bavaria and received everything east of the Rhine. In fact, he even gained the wealthy cities of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer on the west bank of the Rhine. Actually, possession of both sides of the Rhine made sense since it was a key transport link and the huge archdiocese of Mainz sprawled along the river. In addition to Aquitaine, Charles received Barcelona, Septimania, Burgundy, Neustria, and part of Austrasia. Everything in the middle went to Lothar, basically the Kingdom of Italy, Provence, part of Burgundy, and almost all of Austrasia. All three kingdoms were roughly the same size, but Lothar's kingdom stretched from Rome to Frisia on the North Sea, so it seemed likely that he would be squeezed by his brothers. More important, Lothar no longer claimed to be supreme over his brothers. Although he retained his position of emperor, Charles and Lothar were no longer required to acknowledge his authority. Still, Lothar kept Aachen, the closest to a capital of Frankia, so he could tell himself that he was emperor of the Frankish Empire, just a much smaller empire. It is important to point out that the actual division looks idiotic on a map because the brothers were not trying to carve out new, hopefully permanent kingdoms based on clear territorial boundaries. Instead, they were trying to divide up the family inheritance, and each one wanted at least part of the heartland, while the rest of the division reflects the location of their key supporters. To be fair, the division of the family lands among the male heirs had been normal for centuries. Charles the Great had forged a massive empire through conquest and annexation, but he had attempted to unite the different regions and cultures into a shared greater political entity. However, that political entity was a fragile creation, held together by force, and it broke apart roughly 30 years after his death. Instead, the empire would be divided into West Frankia under Charles, Middle Frankia under Lothar, and East Frankia under Louis. Actually, Middle Frankia would be called Lotharingia, basically Lothar's lands. The division agreed upon at Verdun was naturally intended to be a temporary solution to end the fighting. Actually, there was no reason to believe that the division would be permanent. The empire had remained a single whole for generations. The only change had been the expansion outwards. The three brothers may have accepted that none of them could rule the entire empire, but they undoubtedly were incapable of shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, it could be worse, and it's not worth dying over. During the Merovingian period, Frankia had repeatedly been divided among several sons, but it had reformed. In theory, if only one of the brothers had an heir, the kingdoms would be reunited into a single empire, but the odds were against it. Lothar had 2 sons, and Louis had 3, while Charles would likely soon have a child with his young bride. Would the Frankish Empire reform? Spoiler alert. East Frankia would become Germany and West Frankia would become France, but I will discuss those kingdoms in future series. To sum up, the 3 brothers agreed to divide the empire between them. However, they discovered that they did not know the full value of the various regions within the empire, so they postponed negotiations for nearly a year while their representatives surveyed the empire. When the survey was completed, the brothers met at Verdun and divided the empire into 3 kingdoms. Charles received Aquitaine, Barcelona, Burgundy, and Neustria, which became West Frankia. Louis received Bavaria and everything east of the Rhine, including Saxony, which became East Frankia. Lothar received Italy, Provence and Austrasia, which became Middle Frankia. This series was much longer than I originally planned, so I will take a break before I return with the next series. Thanks for listening, If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.